The path to end suffering is to meet it head on, particularly suffering that's related to injustice. So, what we do when we decide to engage in being just in the world and in advancing justice in the world is we access the power of our internal lives.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today, my guest is Dr. Kamilah Majied, a professor, therapist, and influential thinker in the realms of social justice and emotional wellness. In this episode, we discuss her latest work, Joyfully Just: Black Wisdom and Buddhist Insights for Liberated Living, a book that invites us to engage with joy as a radical act of resistance. Together, we explore how language and culture can play pivotal roles in shaping our approach to liberation, and how art, music, and contemplative practices can nurture joy as well as help us in confronting the biases of our own intuition. Through this discussion, Dr. Majied shares how interdependence and Buddhist insights, when blended with Black wisdom traditions, can offer rich perspective and possibility for both justice and joy. So dig in and get ready to build your discomfort resilience and stoke your fierce compassion in this conversation with Dr. Kamilah Majied. Dr. Kamilah Majied, thank you so much for joining us again on Voices of Esalen.
I am so happy to be back. It's delightful to be back with you. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Today, we're celebrating the birth, the emergence of your book, Joyfully Just: Black Wisdom and Buddhist Insights for Liberated Living.
Yes, it does feel very much like a birth. It's remarkable because and a birth that I've been pregnant with for many, many years. It's the longest pregnancy imaginable. But yeah, it does feel like that, and I feel kind of a sense of joy just sharing these ideas with the world because it's important to me that people feel encouraged and I feel like joy is one of the aspects of emotional and psychological well-being that we often don't even reach for. People just want to be okay. It's like feels like too high in aspiration a lot of the time. And I guess what I want to kind of offer, a central message of the book is it's always present, and that we get to kind of do the inner work of surfacing it. So yeah, I'm excited about it for that reason. I'm also excited about it because it contains a lot of wisdom that I have received and absorbed from my own teachers, many Black people, people of African heritage, who just have so much insight into how to navigate suffering with joy. The fifth chapter of the book is called Joyful Suffering or Joyful Grieving. And I really draw on a lot of what I call Black wisdom traditions to articulate what that looks like. And I correlate it with the reality that suffering is inevitable, right? That's a core Buddhist insight, that there are sufferings of life, birth itself, the thrashing to come into this chilly world with bright lights from the warmth of the womb is a suffering. And then we age and we get ill and we die and parts of our bodies die in the illness and we see loved ones die. So these are realities that are inescapable, and joy is always present and accessible in all of these realms. So I feel a sense of real hope about people being encouraged. I know when you publish a book, people have a lot of reasons to publish a book, but I want people to be happier. That's why I'm excited that Joyfully Just is in the world.
What in your life gives you joy today? What are you feeling grateful for today?
Oh, so many things, the sunshine, the kind of very present moment joy, the visage of my mother. I'm looking, a photo of my mother is right here next to my monitor. And, the sense of transmission that I feel about this book, that she taught me so much
Hmm.
by the way she lived and by her instructions, her encouragement to read as a meditative practice, her encouragement to engage in social justice as a liberating process for me that wasn't necessarily focused solely on the outcome, but as a process of my own self-development. So I feel very grateful to be able to transmit some of the things that made me strong and wise and happy and free inside in this moment. I feel that. And I feel excited about being with you, Sam, because, Esalen has this great tradition of really thinking outside the box in terms of how humans live enriched, expansive lives. And, I've listened to a few of your podcasts, and you're just really great at helping people understand various ways of growing and developing the interior life in ways that support interpersonal and social aspects of our living, communal aspects of our living, and nature engaged aspects of our living. So I respect that about Esalen's work. And yeah, so I'm really feeling like this is the place to be. I feel home, in some ways.
Oh, well, that's great. No, I appreciate your words so much. And I feel very grateful to be talking with you today. Our interview that we did in 2020 was a pivotal interview for me. It was a pivotal experience. And I want to really encourage folks who are listening to this interview to go back into our archives and go check out Dr. Majied's interview with me in 2020, where we really focus on white supremacy. We focus on conceptions of global majority. And there was a lot of reframing that happened during that discussion. And it was incredibly helpful. And it really was wonderful when I found out that you had this new book, Joyfully Just, coming out, which absolutely builds on some of the concepts I think that we discussed in the first interview. It interweaves Buddhist insights with Black wisdom traditions. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think a Buddhist lens complements the historical and contemporary experiences of Black individuals?
Well, if you think about it, the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, witnessed the suffering of the world from inside the palace gates. Yet, in order to gain wisdom about how to address this suffering that troubled him so deeply, he left the palace gate, right? Which speaks exactly to what you were just talking about and what we talked about in the last podcast. I think the last podcast was called Privilege and Human Potential. Privilege actually can compromise our human potential. And that's very well illustrated by the fact that Shakyamuni Buddha had to leave the palace, the comforts, right? And be in the world and witness and empathize with all those who were suffering in order to become wise, in order to become enlightened, in order to access more joy. And that's a thing that I think is just incredibly important for us to understand. In one section of the book, I talk about wealth fantasy tourism, this whole notion that has become popular where people think as long as I can pose by a yacht or look like I'm living a luxurious life, that equates to happiness.
Mm.
Unfortunately, that does not. As in, from all of my decades of experience as a psychotherapist, I have met so many people and had the opportunity to work with so many people with tremendous wealth who spend their days in tears, or in rage, right? So that to help people to disconnect privilege from their perceptions of what can make us happy is something we can do for our own well-being, right? And also, I wanted to really help people understand that what Buddhism teaches about suffering is that the path to end suffering is to meet it head on, particularly suffering that's related to injustice,
Mm.
right? Because another important Buddhist insight is this notion of interdependence. What's happening in other parts of the world and other parts of the county, in other parts of the country impact me, right? They have an energetic effect. And also they have a psychological impact, right? We know that they're happening, but we just repress, repress, repress. So what we do when we decide to engage in being just in the world and to advance and in advancing justice in the world is we access the power of our internal lives, right? So that because that's what Shakyamuni Buddha and what Buddhism teaches also, that we have so much power, so much possibility. We really don't have to shirk from things like, oh, I can't think about that injustice because I'll be bummed out.
Mm.
Guess what? We're all already bummed out. You know what I mean? We're just distracting ourselves from being bummed out by, watching cat videos, which is nothing wrong with watching cat videos. And being engaged in the world in a way that advances justice is very much what Buddhism is about. Buddhism is about being in the world in a way that is present with insight, that witnesses the truth of reality without filters and without absorption and privilege, and that engages in the world to make it better. That's what the Bodhisattva vow is. so when I look at that and I look at the wisdom traditions that I talk about in the book, and a lot of people are like, well, what do you mean by Black wisdom traditions? I'm like, thank you for asking that question. The reason that it was so important to me to articulate those in this book is because a lot of people think that cultural wisdom practices, the ones that we're aware of or that get kind of popularized, might be from Indigenous people, which is fantastic, or from Asian heritage people, which is fantastic. And yet, there are a lot of Black wisdom practices that are kind of dismissed and not necessarily seen as wisdom practices. They're seen more as kind of entertainment. For example, I talk a lot about music and Black music as a way of accessing that inner spaciousness. Black music as a meditative, contemplative tool for self-regulation, for insight, for self-transcendence. It's been amazing watching these protests unfold on these campuses, listening to young people singing these gospel songs, I Shall Not Be Moved, and This Joy That I Have. There's this one video of a young woman singing, This joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me, and the world can't take it away. She's singing that as she is being carried away to be arrested. She's singing. And that moment, those kinds of moments are very self-transcendent. This is exactly what Black people did in the 60s, being beaten and posed, trying to get out of the way. And that also mirrors a story. There's a story in the Lotus Sutra about Bodhisattva never disparaging, who was attacked with sticks and staves, and for spreading Buddhism and for encouraging people to develop their enlightenment. He was attacked. So he would get out of the way, but then he would keep doing the work. And this is it perfectly mirrors what I see as the legacy of Black activism. So Black activism is one of the wisdom traditions. Black joy-infused, song-infused activism is one of the wisdom traditions that's been emulated the world over, just all over the world. And then Black music itself as a means of kind of regulating or expressing feelings and emotions. The reason they're doing hip hop in, Yugoslavia and Korea is because it is a way of expressing one's power and one's assertiveness, right? And the reason that blues is a global phenomena is because it speaks to using sorrow creatively, singing your blues. I have practices in the book where I invite people to sing their blues because it's a way of transmuting the suffering and actually having joy about it because you're singing about it. And the blues comes from African heritage people singing in the fields of enslavement. That was self-transcendence. They were like, I'm still human. I'm still reaching for my spirit. And my song is the proof of my humanity and validates it to me and to everyone else around me. Those kinds of song practices are also wisdom traditions. I'll mention one more and then I'll stop. But a lot of people don't know that DAP, the gesticulation practice, where people have different movements in doing brief greetings, or even the high five and the fist bump, that these are all practices that began in Black communities. And oftentimes they emerged because there were oppressive contexts where people needed to be able to quickly and concisely affirm each other and recognize each other. So DAP, for example, was developed by African American soldiers, many of whom were unjustly interned in Vietnam. But it's interesting that these are embodied practices of greeting, of noticing our interconnectedness, and it's a wisdom practice. Everybody does high fives and fist bumps all over the world, and very few people notice, wow, this is one of the ways that Black people have made this offering to the world that has been so valuable, that is such an embodied way of connecting with someone, whether it's at a bus stop or at your dinner table. So I feel like this is so exciting, and for people to recognize this is more than just kind of casual social interaction. These are ways that we can recognize that we already are enriched by Black people's creativity and culture, and increase our sense of connection and appreciation around that.
You also advocate for cultural humility and an end to cultural appropriation. So while folks can appreciate Black wisdom traditions, there are ways that they can practice them more or less consciously.
Oh, that's such a good point. I was just talking when I gave a book talk recently about Black dialect, how Black dialect and Black expressions are also emulated internationally. And this goes back a long time, but I will, for this example, I'll only take it back to around the 1940s when Black jazz musicians started using the word cool, to describe an emotional state, to describe a state of equanimity, right? And one of the Buddhist paramis is equanimity. Equanimity in Black dialect is cool, right? So it's like, and it's such a resonant term because it's again speaks to an embodied experience. Like that's why I talk about Black dialect as a wisdom tradition, because it articulates an embodied, interconnected human experience in a way that is so insightful and precise that other people naturally use the term because it reflects a human experience, a common human experience, right? That's like the difference between saying, I feel you and I understand what you feel. I feel you talks about empathy. It speaks our interconnectedness.
Mm.
There's just so many examples of that. And my invitation to folks is that pay attention to it. Pay attention to how much Black dialect is a part of how you speak and Black expressions are a part of how you speak, because that is awareness of your own, of the ways that you are influenced by Black people and your connection to them, right? So just kind of my invitation is wake up to this connection, wake up to this influence in your life, wake up to the ways that you already embody your interdependence with Black people. And as much as possible, try to acknowledge it, right? It's not like every time anyone uses an African American expression, they should say, as African Americans say, or as Black people say, but sometimes that's a good thing to do to elevate our awareness that, this is language that we're borrowing because it's wise language that articulates how we feel.
Mm-hmm. You also talk about this concept of discomfort resilience, which can be useful for folks who might feel defensive about having been pointed out, like maybe that's not wise speech, or maybe that could be more sensitive. So could you please kind of speak about this concept of discomfort resilience and how it can be useful for us?
Oh my goodness, so many ways. It's interesting because, like, think about it, how many meditation retreats you've been to, right? Meditation itself is not always comfortable. Your body, especially if you're doing some kind of sitting practice or some kind of silent practice, you know, your body starts to be uncomfortable and your mind, of course, gets uncomfortable because it wants to, we're so drawn to our distractions. I remember going to a silent retreat, my first silent retreat, and I was like, wow, this is really hard. You know what I mean? Because you start to feel uncomfortable and you recognize that many of us are very uncomfortable in our own skin. And that's a good place to start because you want to be comfortable in your own skin, comfortable in your silence. And the wonderful thing about working to develop capacity to push past the need for comfort all the time is actually the thing that makes your comfort zone grow.
Mm.
You become comfortable with discomfort when you challenge yourself to move out of these comfort zones. And, that can relate to anything. Like I use the gym analogy, right? Some of that is uncomfortable. Even the idea of preparing to get in the car and go to the gym or go downstairs if you have a home gym to your gym can be just like, oh, goodness. But the capacity to push past that feeling of, oh, I don't feel like it is exactly what's necessary for us to grow.
Absolutely.
It's necessary to grow intellectually. It's necessary to grow in family relationships, right? Sometimes you have to have uncomfortable conversations with family members, and oftentimes people avoid it, right? Describing themselves as conflict averse. And yet, there's a piece of growth that can only be had when we lean into the discomfort, and the conflict and say, let's explore this together. We can do this. We find in that process an inner capacity. It's like, oh, I can handle more than I thought I could. Just like when you go to the gym, you add a little more weight and a little more weight, you're stronger. The same speaks to inner strength. Discomfort resilience is an aspect of inner strength. And in relationships, it allows us to hear challenging things that are meant for our growth or that we can grow from and to use them for our growth. Even things that are meant in kind of less than, with than the best intentions. If we have discomfort resilience, we can think about how can I use this incident, right? If somebody hurts my feelings, how can I use this experience to grow in my capacity to stay grounded in my worth? Right? If we're always thinking, always have this lens of everything is going to help me grow and make me stronger, then we're able to have joy even when unpleasant things happen. And certainly when it comes to addressing things like racism or sexism or homophobia or any kind of oppression, we have to be strong in our inner lives, and we have to have a kind of relational courage, right? That I have the courage to correct you, and that I don't do it out of the kind of cancel culture or point out how you're doing anything wrong. I do it to invite you in. I do it because I care about you. In the book, I talk about fierce compassion, right? There's the compassion that's soothing, that feels good. Oh, I'm going to get a massage. And then there's the compassion that feels like hard and uncomfortable, right? A colonoscopy is also a compassionate thing to do for yourself, but it is not comfortable. Separating our notion of compassion from this notion of comfort. Sometimes compassion does not feel comfortable. It's an act of, taking care of myself or taking care or supporting someone else in a way that pushes them to grow. In the book, I say it takes fierce compassion to correct someone when they are doing or saying something unjust. And it takes discomfort resilience to receive the correction with gratitude. And that is a way that humans can begin to relate to one another, where we don't have to feel like so much shame and rage when someone says, oh, Kamilah, that was kind of sexist or transphobic, what you just said. Maybe you should think about rephrasing that or what your intention is there. And I can say, oh my goodness, thank you so much. You just handed me a gift, an opportunity to look at how cisgender privilege is skewing my view of reality. Thank you for helping me grow. If that's my approach to being guided and corrected and being more just, then yeah, lots of joy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh my God. I mean, you're almost describing the journey that I went on, several years ago, realizing in no small part due to the conversation that we had that could be a generative way of self-correction where I was going to feel more joy. I was going to feel more connected. I was going to feel close to people who were outside of my orbit by acknowledging the fact that I had overlooked them or that I had been out of right relationship with them. I'm just thinking about this off the top of my head right now, but it feels like a lot of the work that you are doing within this book is the juxtaposition of two things that sound like they should be polar opposites, but actually when they are put together, they lead towards a path of discovery, a kind of self-revelation.
Absolutely. That suffering itself contains joy. I mean, each stage of life comes with loss. So when you have a baby, for example, it's wonderful, it's glorious. And they're suffering because you
Mhm.
lose, you grieve your time, you grieve your sleep, you grieve, many things, right? And so to be able to lean into that suffering, like, and let it change you,
Mm,
let it grow us,
mm.
right? Let's lean into suffering and let it grow us. That comfort is not our expansiveness, because what you were just talking about when you were describing how your ability to appreciate guidance and correction, helps because you realize that it helps free you. It's like, oh, I'm free. I'm freer than I thought. I'm freer, especially when I don't cling to
Mm.
unjust ways of being and interacting. And when I let myself grow, like a lot of the times, we get caught up in guilt or shame if we get a correction. And it's okay if that's a stop on the road, if you notice grief or shame arising. And it's so important to not let ourselves get paralyzed by it.
Mhm.
So, for example, if we're thinking about children, I have a whole chapter in the book called Power and Playfulness, where I talk about young people's oppression and adultism. And I am speaking with all of us who have young people in our lives about how to be in a just relationship and a non-adultist relationship with children and adolescents and just folks who are younger than us. And I've had parents, in family therapy or when they were talking to me when their kid wasn't in the room, they're like, how am I going to parent without, being adultist, without shutting down their rights? And, of course, the same thing in schools. And the answer is practice slowing down, pausing, and consistently thinking about what is your power and privilege in relationship to this young person, and how can you use your power and privilege to empower them. What decisions could they have more autonomy about? Because one of the characteristics of adultism on all types of oppression is that it removes people's autonomy and agency. So, as we push ourselves to do those things, we have so much more meaningful and beautiful relationships with the younger people in our lives, relationships where we're giving them the legacy of empowerment. A lot of my students, when they get to graduate school, they struggle to speak up. They struggle to participate verbally in class. And that's because we often do not invite young people to be part of important conversations. We give them a kind of children should be seen and not heard attitude, or you'll know more when you're younger, when you're older, condescension, so that young people feel like, well, maybe I don't really have anything to say and I'll have something to say when I'm older. But then guess what? Then they're older. Nobody's going to wave a magic wand and they're suddenly empowered to talk. So it's one of those things where I'm excited about that too, about the book's engagement for those of us who are a bit older, to really think about how we empower and resource the younger generation and learn from them, because being older doesn't make you necessarily wiser. In many ways it can make you more jaded, less courageous, right? So there's lots we can learn from young people, and assessing our adultism and looking at how we can release that adultism. And it works on the other end of the age spectrum too. There are a lot of ageist ideas out there, devaluation of people who are aging. And it's in some ways that comes more harshly at women. And aging is one of the sufferings of life, right? It's like, and if you're not aging, guess what that means? You're dead, So aging is pretty fantastic. I am aging, and I hope to keep aging for a very long time.
I think there's a lot there too in terms of gaining empowerment by giving up power in a certain way. You talk about some of the internalized white supremacist cultural characteristics, including right to comfort, but you also talk about power hoarding versus power sharing.
Yeah, it's a real thing. Like people in the book, I talk about reparative relationality. Like when people think about reparations, they think about like land back. There's been land back initiatives and actions returning land that was stolen from African American people also in this country. There's a way that we can lean into and pay attention to these reparations activities that are happening in the world, and at the same time consider what reparative relationality looks like. So if traditionally our relationships with young people have been oppressive, right? If we're a teacher or a parent or an aunt, any relationship with young people, to pay attention to what ways, have I possibly not used my privilege in a way that's empowering, and how can I repair that? And even if I haven't done it, if I recognize this as a systemic issue, for example, if I recognize that women have fewer opportunities or Black people in my organization have fewer opportunities, what would it be like to say, when I'm up for a promotion or an opportunity, to say, I'd like to do it, but can I be partnered with someone of African heritage or with a trans member of our community? Because I'm trying to repair our institution in relation to colleagues and other human beings with whom I share the world, right? That's how we make the world more just. And of course, it's uncomfortable. It's like anytime you're offered an opportunity, the first thing is that power hoarding. Yes, I'll take it for me. I'll be at the top. I'll be first author, my name on the marquee. Like that's a very natural human response. And I can tell you from experience the joy of saying, well, let my student, be the one who does the main speaking, right? Because they have, less power, or, who can I share this power and opportunity with?
Mm,
When our minds start to work that way, there's just a level of freedom because you see you have influence. You have influence on how the world is. The world isn't hierarchical and disproportionately unjust because of those people. It's because of us people, right? We have agency, and it's like, oh my God, I can make the world just by if I'm being invited to do a presentation at work, I can say, well, are there any interns, maybe African heritage interns or Latinx interns or indigenous interns who could co-lead this with me so they could have the visibility, right? It's just, we can transform so much with that. And, yes, it's going to be good for the person we invite in. Yes, it's going to be good for the organization. And fundamentally, it's good for us because we're free. Like we don't have to hold on so tight. We're not in such a scared place. You have to work through some feelings to get there.
right.
You're going to feel like, oh, I really would like this just for myself. But when you can work through those, then you experience a level of joy and connection, and a joy and possibility, and a joy in your influence and what you're modeling that has legacy. We can't have a certain kind of legacy if we're not inclusive and sharing.
Mm. Well, I think that is a central tenet of this book, is that ultimately all these practices are good for us. You are advocating for doing some work, divesting from comfort, with the ultimate goal of spreading justice for a greater good, but also experiencing joy on an individual level. And I think that's sort of like, that's kind of catchy and flashy and attractive to me.
Mudita, this Buddhist concept of mudita is, empathic joy and shared joy. So you not only have your joy of, transcending the limitation in the tight inner space that feels like, oh no, it's just mine, right? It's a tight space. So when you're free of that, you're like, it's ours, right? There's just a spaciousness to your interior capacity when you do that. And you also have the joy that people feel when you do share with them, when you do, and you have the joy of institutional change. So it's this exponential experience of joy that just has so many reverberations and resonances beyond a single moment. And it can be very small things, like you go in front of me in the line. It can be day-to-day practices that we always are thinking about. One of the things I invite people to do in the book is to set intentions, for the week and even for the day. Like, how will I engage justly today? Right? As an aspect of my psychological and emotional well being, and of course, which is related to making the world better. And when we set an intention to do that, then the opportunities just pop up. It's like, oh, here's a chance. Here's a chance to be just. And in so doing, I create more joy for myself and everyone around me.
Mm.
Right? It's this mindset that we develop, that we're always looking for opportunities to do it. And when we look for them, we see them.
I'm kind of interested to hear from you how central contemplative practices are to stoking this joyfulness. For those who might be unfamiliar with meditative or contemplative practices, how would you recommend they begin incorporating contemplative practice into their pursuit of justice or personal peace?
Thank you for asking that question because, a lot of the times we think that if we just learn about something, if we just get the information, that will make us change. However, we need a kind of process for our emotional growth, for the development of kind of interpersonal courage and inner courage and emotional courage. We need a process for that. So meditative practices and contemplative processes can be ways of kind of being in dialogue and in communication with our inner life before and as we engage with the world. I talk about the importance of pausing. A lot of times people ask me, well, what do you do if you want to say something, but you're not sure if it's microaggressive or unjust thing to say? And my answer is you pause. So when I say meditative or contemplative practice, they can be formal practices like mindful breathing, which is always a good thing to do, right? They could be, yoga. They could be the music practices that I talk about in the book. I talk about using music in various ways. I talk about using music in grieving. I talk about using music in empowerment, right? So there are lots of contemplative practices, including the music-based contemplative practices I talk about in the book. And there is also the very simple act of pausing, right? So if you don't know, if I say to people, if you don't know what to say, if you don't know if the question you're going to ask or the statement you're going to make is unjust or microaggressive, just pause. Pausing is a contemplative practice because in that pause, you can turn to yourself and ask meaningful questions. So pausing and inquiry our inner inquiry are the core pieces of contemplative practice. Just slow down and ask yourself, for example, why do I want to ask this question, right? If I want to ask somebody where they're from, why do I want to ask that? Do I want to ask that because I want to develop a relationship with them?
Hmm.
Well, if I want to develop a relationship with them, what's the best question to ask? Is it how are you, maybe, right? Instead of where are you from? Because I've had that happen to me so much, so often, especially, in Monterey, which is less ethnically diverse than some areas. And, folks, especially if I'm like wearing a head wrap or I'm wearing some African garb, people are like, where are you from? Those clothes are so interesting. And I'm from New Jersey. I'm from New York. I am. I was born in New York. And, and they're like, where are you from? And I get what they're doing. And I said, no, I'm from New York and grew up in New Jersey. Where are you from? And see, the other thing about the pause, if they had given themselves the opportunity to pause and reflect on their intent, they would know the truer question that they want to ask me, which is, what's your ethnicity or what's your nationality?
Mm.
And since so pause to even know what your question is or what your comment is. So contemplative practices have this relationship with just self-knowledge and self-awareness, right? Because so much of the time we're interacting with people and we don't even know what our intentions are, right? So and that can be with your spouse, with your grandparent, right? To just pause and notice your intention, to have enough insight to carry out that intention in the way that is the most thoughtful.
Earlier in this conversation, you mentioned for a moment, folks who are doing protesting now. And just the title of your book makes me think about social activists and their plight, because there's a lot of suffering in the fight for justice. And I'm wondering, what advice would you offer to activists and practitioners who find themselves struggling to maintain joy amidst this fight for what they see as justice?
Yeah, I think one of the things is to definitely stay centered in your intention and don't let issue, so to speak, distract you from your intention. Because one of the things, like I've been watching some of the protests, and the folks who seem most joyful have the most equanimity. Again, I keep coming back to that Buddhist parami of equanimity because it's a quality. A parami is a perfection of mind in Buddhist philosophy, and perfection only meaning like it's one of the ways we strengthen our minds. And by mind, we mean like heart, spirit, all of that. So equanimity is achieved through all kinds of contemplative practice, including returning to our intention, our resolve. Resolve is another Buddhist parami, our commitment to be just towards ourselves and to elevate the humanity of other people. So returning to the commitment to that is one of the ways that I know that activists can stay both strong and positively impactful. Like Martin Luther King talked about that a lot. And, like I've been watching, folks get hit and spit on, and they've been emulating what they've learned from this 1960s Black civil rights movement of just don't engage. If someone spits on you, you don't slap them. And can you imagine how much discomfort resilience that takes? It's like you have to be willing to bear the profound discomfort of someone harming you or shouting epithets at you, and stay grounded in your resolve to be just and to act from your highest, most elevated self. Because we all know how to jump into, oh, you say something to me, I'll say something back. It takes more strength. It takes a more expansive life condition to, say, I'm sorry that you're doing that, but I'm not going down to that level. I'm not gonna allow my humanity, which is connected to respecting your humanity, to be diminished by getting into abusive or violent activity. Of course, we have to defend ourselves, but part of the way that I think that activists can stay well is recognizing and continuing to return to their intention. I am here because, and also to recognize that they are part of a lineage, right? Because sometimes we feel so alone and we feel like, oh, this isn't going to change. And we most certainly give up when we don't see a benefit in a couple of weeks, And so this is another place where I feel like the legacy of African heritage people around the globe is such a mirror to humanity's possibility to, grow up enslaved any part of the world that experienced slavery, from Jamaica to the Congo to the US, and see your grandparent enslaved and your grandchildren enslaved, and to still say, I'm going to survive, I'm going to live, there is hope. That is a tremendous legacy of hope that's been, and an example of acting on hope that's been bequeathed to humanity. And it's guidance, it's wise guidance, because they accepted the reality. Maybe this doesn't change in my lifetime. Maybe I go to my grave with my grandparent enslaved and with my grandchildren enslaved. Or maybe I go to my grave with my grandparents in Jim Crow and my grandchildren experiencing, disproportionate police violence. And yet I will remain hopeful because it's bigger than my impact in this particular temporal realm. I'm fulfilling kind of a karmic responsibility. I'm fulfilling the purpose of my advent in this historical moment. So it's not like I need to be attached to the outcome. I'm going to take these social justice actions so I can have this particular result. Yes, you want to have a particular result. And what I would say to activists and those of us who are trying to make the world better is the result is manifest in your being.
Mm.
The struggle for, peace and justice will go on for generations.
Mm.
So don't get attached to immediate gains, because then you'll give up. You'll feel like, well, I didn't see it in my lifetime, or many of us need more instant gratification. That I didn't see anything this week. I've been out here in the cold for a week and this isn't resolved, So of course, take care of yourself, take breaks, because it is a long haul, and know that each of us doing our little part during our lifetime is part of the larger thread of improving all of humanity for all time.
You speak about language. You write that there's an inherent violence that can be expressed through language. So my question for you is, how do we explore language and challenge this violence in order to work towards a kind of liberation and justice?
That's a really great question, because language itself is a meditative practice, right? Or language can be a way of being mindful. We can be mindful through our speech. In fact, mindful speech is one of the aspects of mindfulness, right? It's one of the ways that mindfulness is expressed. So taking that moment to pause and think, okay, again, what is the intention? What is the resolve? And letting that inform what comes out of our mouths is just an incredibly valuable thing to do. And because we're often so compelled or propelled to speak quickly, we often don't speak as wisely as we could, right? And I'm not saying wise to appear sagacious or erudite or anything like that. I'm saying wise to feel like I said what I meant.
Uh-huh.
I let my real heart and intention come through in what I said. One of the ways that language can help us, practicing mindful speech can help us to use language to be just towards ourselves and one another. We also get to continue to re-examine and learn new language, right? Like we last time we were together, I talked about the term people of the global majority instead of the term people of color because, it speaks to folks. The language of colonizers and enslavers was just labeling people by color and placing them on hierarchies, with, white, the closer to white you were, proximity to whiteness being the valuation. And so if we step out of that language, sometimes that can be valuable, but also, it cognitively kind of corrects our notion that white racialized people are the majority, and the majority of the world are people who are Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian. And it's just useful to say that because, for example, the language now is not to refer to people as minorities. It's to refer to them as people who have been minoritized, right? Because saying minorities means, they're smaller, they're minor, and they're fewer, which there are none of. They're not smaller, minor, or fewer. So, changing our language just helps us be more aware of what's true. Calling people with physical challenges invalids, well, what does the word invalid mean, right? It's like, no, that's not what I mean. So you don't correct the language to be PC. That's not the point. It's to say what you mean. You don't mean invalid. You don't mean they're lesser. So continuing to think about our language, what's the most inclusive way I can say this? It's fun to think that way. My students were giving presentations in class this week, and I kept gently nudging them around not using gendered language like you guys all the time. Why do we say you guys instead of you people or you girls, right? We don't say you women, right? Because we have this patriarchal, whatever guys is applies to everyone. And it's like, of course it doesn't. We don't mean that. But they had such a hard time with it. So they were using the Southern y'all. And, it's good. It's fun. I'm not trying to be prescriptive, and certainly not, I don't recommend calling each other out. I feel like we can call each other in and just keep inviting one another's growth and have fun with it while we do it. It's like we're growing, we're trying, and not beat ourselves up when we make a mistake. It's like, oops, all right, I'm going to do better next time.
This reminds me of that in your book, you talk about the Black cultural roots of the word woke. I'd be interested to hear you speak about that if you would.
Exactly. Stay woke is a notion, a Black expression that Black people shared with one another to remind us to stay aware of the ways that racism, white supremacy was trying to compromise our well-being. So instead of feeling, for example, like I'm a failure in life, if my boss keeps promoting everyone who's white around me and not me, when my Black colleague says, stay woke, they're saying, recognize that racism is operating here. Don't get into a depression about this. Recognize there's another variable. Right? When you go into that neighborhood or when you drive down south down these roads, be aware that you may be stopped by police. So stay vigilant for the ways that racism might harm your body, your mind, your life, your work, your children. So it was a really call to our own vigilance to keep our own safety. So it's funny that that word got appropriated and then completely misunderstood. It's like it was never meant for people who don't care about Black well-being. It's like it's not, don't use that word is not supposed to feel good to you if you haven't reached a place where you care about Black well-being. Of course you're going to hate woke, but it's also kind of ironic because what's wise about the term woke is that it's like I want insight, I want awareness, I want to be present with what's real in the world, not just the pasty privileged world. I want to know what's real. And so now this anti-woke, it's like, no, I want to go back to sleep. I don't want to know what's real. Are you sure? That doesn't sound like a way to be joyful, because you can't have joy without being present with both pain and suffering. can't have joy without being woke. And the reason that in Black dialect it's woke instead of awake, because woke has this kind of urgency to it, this kind of this is now, like it's a present moment thing. Like awake is almost a softer, uh, gentler level of awareness. And the term woke speaks to a sharper level of awareness. And who doesn't want that acute level of insight? It doesn't mean that you're guarded. It means that you are fully present with all of the realities. And from that place, because you know that there is both danger and opportunity, there is oppression and opportunities to create justice, you can make really wise, impactful decisions. So I'm going to stay woke. I highly recommend it.
Oh man, you said something there that I want to repeat and see if I got it. But you said that you can't have joy without suffering, without being woke.
Absolutely.
There's something beautiful in your book that you wrote. You suggesting practices that allow us to, quote, kindly yet rigorously remove the dirt of unexamined privilege from the clear water of our essential being. And I just love that. And later in the book, you quote this Buddhist aphorism, no mud, no lotus.
It's really true. If I'm walking around in my, elitist privilege as an academic, it's such a small, tight world. I wouldn't want that world. And it's not even real. It's not even real, right? Because I'm still, so many other things. I'm not in touch with all the other things that I am. So privilege also blocks us off from the other aspects of ourselves, right? So a person might be a parent and they are also a learner in the world, right? So if they only relate to their child from this place of I'm the parent and not accessing the place, removing that dirt of privilege and power enough to be a learner in that relationship, they miss so much joyful interaction with their children. They suppress their children's joy and don't learn from it, So, and the same is with other relationships. So, yeah, when we can release the bindings of privilege to say, well, what can I learn here? How can I grow here? How can I share power? How can I be inclusive? How can I lean into discomfort to stop power hoarding and to empower and to share power with? There's just so much joy in that process. And no, we can't get to that without going through the discomfort of, maybe feeling I don't wanna, or this is the easy way, right? The easy way isn't the joyful way. Not always, and not often, actually. I'd even say not often.
Dr. Kamilah Majied, you are the author of Joyfully Just, Black Wisdom and Buddhist Insights for Liberated Living. Would you please tell people how they can find this book?
Oh, well, it's available everywhere. And as an aspect of reparative relationality, I definitely encourage you to look for Black bookstores and support Black bookstores because they are often undersought. So it's a way of being kind of reparative relationality with Black folks and supporting Black economic well-being globally. And of course, it's available at Barnes and Nobles and all your favorite independent bookstores. Oh, and also I'll encourage folks to look at social justice bookstores and mindfulness-based bookstores, meditations shops. I know Spirit Rock has it, Omega has it. A lot of the meditation centers have it. I'm sure Esalen has it. So I would encourage you to use your dollars when you purchase it to let that process of getting the book actually be a joyfully just action. Even the purchase can be a joyfully just action. And of course, you can visit my website. You can reach out to me at CamilahMajied.com. And please, when you do go to the website, just scan the QR code so that you get the newsletter about different events that I have upcoming. So those are some of the ways that you can reach out to me. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. So all the usual places.
Dr. Kamilah Majied, thank you so much for this conversation. Thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. It was a joy to be here.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme music is composed by Nico Holloman. All additional music is by Blue Dot Sessions. Stay tuned for further episodes. And if you really like what's going on, please rate and review this podcast. Yes, it's your way to help.